Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Conor Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're going to be starting with our History of Israel series, and this is going to be the very first part of it, right? So we're going to have it split into 5 different parts. So this video is 1799 to 1917. The next video is going to be 1917 to 48. The video after that's going to be 48 to 67. The video after that is going to be 67 to the year 2000. And then the final video is going to be the year 2000 to the present day. So with all of that, there's going to be lots of stuff. But the way to kind of look at it is that, that's way I describe it, is that this is a kind of in-depth overview. Now, some videos, such as from the great YouTube channel, Sam Aronow, I highly recommend you check out his channel because he goes really in depth with lots of Jewish history over the course of many thousands of years. And now his channel is starting to kind of get into the territory which we're going to be discussing today. But this video isn't like that, right? If that makes sense, because we're going to be looking at the history of the land of Israel / Palestine throughout all of this era, right? So first of all, if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell button so notified for all of our upcoming videos. We also have many videos talking about multiple different subjects, so definitely don't forget to check those out as well. You won't be disappointed at all. But also have to give a massive shout out to Jake Sussman, because he, or actually I'm assuming that's his actual name, but he recommended that I do a video on the Mandate of Palestine. And that's what got me thinking about doing a video on this. Because in this so-called in-depth overview, it's going to be different than many other videos that talk about the history of Israel. Oftentimes when people do a history of Israel, it's very kind of, they cover a great span of time with just a few words and kind of say, oh, this happened and that happened, that happened. And that's kind of not what we're going to be doing in this video or in like the rest of this series, because I think that misses out some of the important facts within it. And with history, the thing is that you have to kind of dive into the kind of you have to dive into the depths of it, to get a full appreciation and understanding of it. So that's what this series is going to aim to do. So without further ado, we're going to dive now into the actual beginning of our story. Now, before we actually dive into the period that we're actually talking about here, I have to make 2 quick caveats here, both of which were inspired by Sam Aronow's latest video, which was Zionism Before Herzl. So within that, he made the point that Jews have nearly always lived outside of the state of Israel, So as far back as 200 BC, the majority of the world's Jews lived outside of what we would today call Israel. And that's because they were involved in trading and in business across the entire Near East and the Mediterranean region. So all the different empires and all different kingdoms that they have in that time, there were Jews who lived there in different settlements and they were involved in the trade across that region. So that's the first kind of caveat we have to say, which is that Jews living in diaspora is nothing new. The second thing to talk about is the fact that the Jews, I thought that the Jews were all completely kicked out by the Romans in about 130 AD. That isn't necessarily the case, because while that is the case for Jerusalem, where Jews were kind of expelled from the city, that region of Israel / Palestine still had a majority of its population that were made up of Jews all the way up until the 5th century AD. And the reason why they stopped being the majority is because this represents the rise of Christianity in the late Roman / Byzantine Empire. So many of the people there end up converting to Christianity, and that explains why there was the shift away from there being a Jewish majority. So many Jews obviously did go to Europe and they went to many other places, and this explains part of the kind of wider diaspora. But still, the important thing to remember is that there have always been Jews living there throughout all these centuries, throughout these many millennia. So that's just something that I didn't know beforehand, but it was kind of very eye-opening. So obviously, with regard to this video, you're going, hold on. You said that it's going to be 1799 to 1917. You haven't even mentioned 1799. The reason being is because I'm going to give a very brief overview of the period beforehand. So I'm going to skip over lots of things. So for instance, the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, which was around in ancient times. We're not going to really talk about that. We're not going to talk about the Hellenistic period, which came after the time of Alexander the Great. We're not going to talk about the Roman conquest. We're not going to talk about the Byzantine era. We're not going to talk about the Muslim Arab conquest. We're not going to talk about the Crusades. Instead, we're now kind of skip through all of that, and now we're at the period that we're talking about. So in 1799, the region which we today call Israel/Palestine was overwhelmingly Muslim Arabs. Now, these people had come since the time of the late 12th century, and this was with the conquest of Salahuddin. So during the Third Crusade, this is when the Muslims, led by Salahuddin, kicked out the final kind of like Christian kingdoms which had been set up there, right? And this now represents 700 years of continuous Muslim rule of this region. So during this time, this is when many Muslim Arabs migrated to the region, and this is why in 1799, 88% of the population of what is today Israel/Palestine were Muslims. Jews made up just about 3 or 4%, and the remainder was Christian Arabs. Most of the Jews tended to center around like the kind of major cities such as Jerusalem, but even there they made up just about a quarter of the population of the city. And most of the Jews who were living there lived under what was called the Old Yeshuv. So these are the Jews who continuously lived in that region throughout that entire time and never left. Now the Ottoman Turks, they're the ones who controlled the region, and they had taken it from the Mamluks, who were another Islamic empire, and they took that in 1516. So all that time there, for almost 400 years, the Ottoman Turks ruled that region, and it was under the subdivision of the Damascus Elayat. I think I pronounced that correctly, hopefully. And the Damascus Elayat was governed by a greater region, which was known as Ottoman Syria. Now, in 1799, in comes Napoleon. Now, as we said in many of our other videos as well, where we were talking about like Napoleon's campaigns throughout Europe, so definitely check those videos out. What this basically led to was the kind of rise of nationalism throughout much of Europe. So with this, obviously you had the rise of German nationalism, Italian nationalism, etc., etc. And although it hadn't really hit this part of the world just yet, this kind of represents the very, very first step in a long road which would eventually lead to the creation of Israel and Palestine as independent national identities. Now, I'm not trying to say that people in those days immediately, when Napoleon invaded, immediately became Zionists and Arab nationalists. That's not the case at all. But this represents a sudden shift in the story, which eventually leads to what we see today. And the reason for that is because in 1799, when Napoleon ended up invading Egypt and Ottoman Syria, this is where, during the siege of Accra, he made a proclamation which said that all the Jews of Asia and Africa ought to come together under his banner, and together they would restore a biblical Jerusalem, and they would create a homeland for the Jews. Now, it's important to note that he didn't mention the European Jews, because in this period he was actually in the process of emancipating many of them, because there was still many anti-Semitic laws throughout Europe which basically deprived them of citizenship within their different kingdoms. So this was something that he was kind of very much focused on within Europe. That's probably why he didn't end up actually including them. Now, this obviously didn't lead to the establishment of the State of Israel, mainly for two reasons. One, because most of the Jews didn't actually rally to his cause, and the second of all was because he was defeated at the siege of Accra. So, kind of didn't end up hearing anything from this, and he kind of just went back to Europe to do his campaigns. But still, this represents the first time in almost 2,000 years that anyone had spoken about the re-establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Now, in 1805, you had Muhammad Ali of Egypt. And what he did is he basically split away Egypt from the rest of the Ottoman Empire, and he basically wanted to set up his own empire within its own rights. So in 1831, he invaded Ottoman Syria, and this is where he did some very unpopular things. Most notably of all was that he tried to conscript the local peasants, right? Now, the local people there, most of which were Arabs, they end up protesting against him. But what they did in 1834 was, in these series of riots, they targeted the religious minorities within the region, most notably the Christians and the Jews. Now, the reason I mention this is because during this whole time where the Muslims were in charge, Jews and Christians were so-called dhimmis, so they were like second-class citizens. They're still respected under the, as people of the book, but at the same time, they don't have the same kind of rights as everyone else. But still, up until this time, they had been largely protected, and much more so than was the case for Jews living in Christian Europe. However, this represents the kind of first notable time where we can see Jews being targeted. And then 4 years later, in 1838, this is where we see the Druze rise up, right? So the Druze are another kind of religious minority that live within the region. And again, these people rose up and they targeted Jews. Now, this led to a huge reaction in Europe, in particular led by Moses Montefiore. So Moses Montefiore was a very wealthy British Jew. He was, a financier, he was a banker, he was a philanthropist, and also he was the first Jewish sheriff of London. So this is the very first high office which is held by any non-Christian within England. So what he did is he ended up meeting with Muhammad Ali Pasha, who a few years before had basically rounded up all of like the local Arabs who had been in revolt and had done all these things. He deported them to Egypt, and then he moved many loyal Egyptian Arabs to the region. So many of the Palestinians today are actually the descendants of Egyptians who were brought over during this time, right? We don't have exact figures because record keeping these times were notoriously bad, right? So what Moses Montefiore did is that when he met with Pasha, he made an agreement with him to set up between 100 and 200 Jewish villages, within the state of Palestine. And this is where people fleeing from persecution could come and settle, and so that was the original plan. However, the Egyptians end up losing that territory in 1840, and it went back to the Ottoman Turks. But the region was still very poor, it was still very underdeveloped, and it just didn't have any agricultural or financial base, right? So you have to think about the fact that Jews are being persecuted all around Europe and stuff, right? So the question then would be, why didn't any of them flee to Palestine? The reason being, it was as bad as the repression was in many places in Europe, Europe still had a much higher standard of living than the land of Palestine, because Palestine was just dirt poor, right? So the few people who happened to move there, most of them were either religious scholars or they were secular intellectuals, and neither of those kind of groups tended to have a lot of expertise when it came to farming. So while they came there with the idea of, we're going to go there and set up like farms and stuff, very quickly they end up abandoning these farms and just move to the major cities anyway, right? So like we said, we don't have like great records throughout this period, but what we can work out is that from about the mid to the late 19th century, this is where there were a few Jews that end up settling there. And this is why the population of Jerusalem, for the first time in many, many centuries, end up becoming majority Jewish. So by 1896, it's estimated that about 62% of the population of the city of Jerusalem were Jewish. However, it still was a situation where only about 4% of the population of the entire region were Jewish still, right? So, like we said, the Jews are very heavily concentrated in a handful of major cities. Now, Europe during this time had basically replaced religious bigotry with scientific bigotry. And what we could see, we're in this age of nationalism, is this thing of scientific racism. So people basically saying that the Jews are a distinct nation, that they can never become part of the nation. So whether it's France or Germany or many of the other places, right, they can never be fully trusted. They will always be a fifth column. They will always have their loyalty questioned, stuff, right? And so this led to a huge amount of repression and a lot of pogroms against the Jews of Europe, in particular within the Russian Empire, where a huge number of them lived. So it's estimated that about 2.3 million Jews end up fleeing during this time from the Russian Empire, with about 80% of them, or like 1.9 million, fleeing to the United States. About 140,000 went to Britain during this time, so roughly about 7%. Again, these figures are subject to kind of change stuff because, depending on what figures you're looking at. Then many of them went to France and Holland and many other kind of like liberal places in Europe and the rest of the world. But during this whole time, so from 1882 to 1903, just 35,000 Jews settled in the land of Palestine. And again, these guys pretty much just stayed mainly in the cities. However, within this group, there were a great range of different people. So you had some people who were religious, some people who were secular, you had some people who were nationalists, and you had some people who were socialists. And many of them brought with them the ideas of Zionism, right? Which was something which was really starting to take root in the late 19th century. And this represents basically Jewish nationalism, is basically the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. So whereas before a handful of Jews had kind of moved there for religious reasons, yeah, just to be close to Jerusalem, now there was an active push for people to settle in this land. And many of these Jews who came there, right, they brought expertise, yeah, on like different farming techniques and different industrial practices, etc., which they took from being in Europe, and they brought it to this region. And they also brought a revival of the Hebrew language, yeah, which had been kind of dormant for many centuries, right? So now you start to see the beginnings of the birth of a like real nation of Israel come through. But of course, we'd be remiss to kind of ignore the fact of the vast majority of people living there, which were Muslim Arabs, right? So they obviously weren't just sitting about during this time. They also had their own movements and desires and hopes and dreams, right? And so in around the 1860s, you start to have the rise of Arab nationalism. So where this Arab nationalism kind of like spurred from, right, was the fact of in the late 19th century, the Islamic world had really fallen behind the West. Whereas a few centuries before, the Islamic world was the center of the whole world. So many of the people, especially the Arabs, yeah, they looked at the Ottoman Turks who were ruling much of this Muslim world, and they said that the reason for their decline was as a result of their decadence and their decay. So only the Arabs could actually spur this kind of revitalization. And so that's where Arab nationalism took root. Of course, most Arabs were just, like loyal subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't really question things. But still, by the outbreak of World War One, the year before, in 1913, you had the very first Arab Congress, which was held in Paris, of all places, right? So this is the first time when Arab intellectuals, Arab leaders and stuff, came together to discuss what a unified Arab state would look like. And now you can start to see two opposite and opposing forces almost begin to collide. So you have Zionism and you have Arab nationalism, and they're almost about to start butting heads, right? But in this period, the Ottomans still controlled this region. Everything's all kind of stayed exactly as it has for centuries, until World War One happened. So with World War One, the Ottomans declare war against the Allies. So the British in 1916, they go to the Arabs, yeah, in particular to the Sharif of Mecca, and basically this is where we see the beginning of the Arab revolt. So the Arab citizens within the Ottoman Empire rise up, and they rise up to support the British upon the promise that when the war is over, they will be given a unified Arab state. Now, the British and the French had other plans, right? So in 1916, you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and within this basically carved up much of the land into different mandates. So you'd have the French controlling Syria and Lebanon, and you have the British controlling Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. So on the 11th of December 1917, this is where General Edmund Allenby marches through the gates of Jerusalem, and this marks the first time that a non-Muslim had control of the city. And just a month before that, you had the Balfour Declaration. Now, within this declaration, this is the first time where the British offer and promise that there will be a homeland for the Jews in the land of Palestine. But it comes with the proviso that the other different religious groups within there, whether it be the Muslims or the Christians, who obviously still make up the majority, they and their civil rights and their religious rights must still be protected. So that is something which was in the Balfour Declaration. And this is finally the point at which we can see these two opposing forces start to collide. So that's what we're going to explore more into the next video when we look at the history of the Mandate of Palestine. So this is where Zionism and Arab nationalism is really going to start butting heads. But if you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also as well, check out our many other videos that we have on many different topics. You won't be disappointed. And with that, have a great day and bye. So where our story finished off last time was with General Allenby marching through the gates of Jerusalem, and this represented the first time in almost 700 years that a non-Muslim had control of the city. So obviously the British and the French had kicked out the Ottoman Turks, and they set up occupied enemy territory administrations, right? So the acronym for this is the OETA, which is quite clumsy of an acronym, but still. So this, it was split up into different sections. So you had OETA South, you had East, you had West, and I believe also you had North as well. Now what we're going to mainly focus on here is the OETA South, and this is what comprises most of the state of Israel / Palestine today. Although the northern part of what's today Israel was taken up by OETA West. So within OETA South, you had just 10% of the population there being comprised of Jews, and you also had a number of Jews, although much less, in East and West OETA. However, this would all change, and you had in 1920 the setting up of the Mandate Palestine. So this now would comprise what we today think of as Israel / Palestine. And during this time, you already had the settings up of the later conflict which would arise between the Arabs and the Jews. And this is because, unlike in other places, right, where you might have the setting up of a combined legislature, a combined kind of organization where people from the territory would come together, in this case here, you can already start to see parallel and completely separate organizations and legislatures being set up. So the Arab nationalists in 1919, they had set up the Palestine Arab Congress, and a year later, the Jews had set up the Assembly of Representatives. So here you can really start to see that the two sides are completely opposite, completely separate, completely parallel. So there's now no dialogue really between the different groups. Both sides are looking out for their own interests, and both sides have no interest in looking after the interests of the others. And this was a time when there was going to be a lot of changes, because before, the Jews of this region had lived under the old Yishuv, and these were the Jews who had lived there throughout all this time, throughout the previous 2,000 years or so, right? And they had always been there. However, you started to have the new Yishuv, and this was comprised primarily of Jews who were coming from the diaspora, and these were primarily those who were coming from Europe, and this was the beginning of the Aliyah. So the Aliyah in Hebrew, it means the ascent, and this is in reference originally to the ascent to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's on a hill. However, the term Aliyah in the sense that we're using it here refers to the mass migration of the Jewish diaspora back to the land of Israel. So during this time, this is when it was really beginning to ramp up, and you can really start to see the mass opposition of this by the Arabs towards these Jewish migrants. So as early as March 1920, you had the Battle of Tel Hai, right? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this marks the very first shot in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was to come. And a month afterwards, you had a series of riots which took place in Jerusalem. So as early as 1920, you can already start to see the Arabs revolting and rioting against the Jewish population, both that are already there and the Jews which are coming in. And also as well, what was notable with this is that the British were very slow to react, which meant that now both the Jews and the Arabs began to distrust them and become very hostile. So it ended up being this pattern of this. The Arabs revolt against the Jews. The British are slow to defend the Jews. The Jews set up paramilitary organizations to defend themselves, and now they distrust the British, and they also distrust the Arabs. So this cycle would basically be the pattern of escalation, which we'd see now throughout the next 28 years of the Mandate's existence. So now we're going to start talking about the mass migration of Jews to this region, and you're going to get an idea of just how drastic and how dramatic this was. So in 1922, just 11% of the population of Palestine were comprised of Jews, and they numbered 84,000. By 1931, they comprised 17% of the population, and you had 175,000 of them. By 1945, they now made up 31% of the population of the region, and you had 553,000 of them. So there was an average annual growth rate of 8.6% with regard to the Jews, compared to just 2.6% for the Arabs. And this was mainly due to mass migration. So most of these Jews were fleeing from Europe, in particular Poland, of which 46% of them end up coming from. So from 1922 to 1936, whilst Muslims increased by just 64%, the Jews end up increasing their number by 558%, with almost 284,000 arriving as immigrants during this time. By 1945, you had 367,845 Jews who had migrated, and these represented 91.7% of all immigrants who came to the region between 1920 and 1945. And 74% of all Jewish population growth is attributable directly to immigration. So it's not as if the Jews are having a lot more children. They are increasing their numbers only because of mass migration. Now, these figures here would have alarmed even Enoch Powell. So like we discussed in our video to do the 6-Day War, Enoch Powell was speaking about a tiny percentage of people coming to Britain at that time as immigrants. In this case here, it was much, much larger. And whereas he had spoken about rivers of blood, and this never came to pass in Britain, in this case here, there really were rivers of blood. Now, most of the Jews here, they weren't just Zionists, right? So obviously some of them came for ideological reasons, right? They want to set up a Jewish homeland in the state of Israel. But many of them were just humble refugees who were fleeing from persecution in Europe. So in particular, in Poland and in Hungary, you had anti-Semitic governments in the 1920s and 1930s who were persecuting Jews and were levying very, very high taxes on them. But in 1933, you started to have a bit of a change of this, right? Because it wasn't just from these places in Eastern Europe. You also started to have German Jews wanting to leave for very obvious reasons. And all of this was really starting to annoy the Arabs, right? So they had opposed the third Ilya, the fourth Ilya, and now the fifth Ilya, right? And this is where you end up having the Great Arab Revolt, otherwise known by them as the Great Palestinian Revolt. So from 1936 to 1939, this is a huge uprising of the Arabs against the British authorities and the new Jewish immigrants, right? And also the settlers who were already there. So obviously this ended up leading to a whole lot of strife and turmoil and stuff. And 5,000 Arabs were killed as the British crushed this revolt. But in this time, you had already had the setting up of the Haganah in 1920, and you had the setting up of the Ergan in 1931. So these are paramilitary Jewish organizations which were set up for the defense of the Jews. And they cooperated with the British in crushing this revolt and also defending the Jewish communities there. So now you start to have a situation whereby, the Arabs can't trust the British because they believe that the Jews are now supporting them, and the Jews are kind of like not really trusting the British because they're being too slow in the defense of them against the Arabs. So as a result of this revolt, you end up having the Jews really start to focus in on their own settlements and their own defenses. And this is where you start to have tower and stockade defenses, right? So this is where the Jewish defenses there, they basically have their own a system of defending their perimeters. And then also as well, the British try and subdue the Arabs, right? They say, okay, right, fine. We're going to put a halt on Jewish migration. So in 1935 alone, you had 61,854 new Jewish immigrants. By 1939, this figure had fallen to just 16,405 new Jewish immigrants for that year. So, they're trying to now put a damp on things. They're saying, okay, right, the Arabs are annoyed because of this mass Jewish migration. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try and put a lid on it. So the Jews obviously still continued, right, to migrate there. And this was the so-called illegal Aliyah, and this was called Aliyah Bet. So for those who know Hebrew, they'll know that Bet is B in the Hebrew alphabet. So this is Aliyah B. So during this time, we had 45,000 illegal Jewish migrants still coming into the region. So the British had tried to cap the number of Jews who were coming there to 75,000 over the period of the next 5 years. And they said in 1937, with the Peel Commission, that there was going to be a partition plan. So the Jews, who were mainly centered in this tiny little region, mainly in the north of the country, they eventually were going to just be partitioned away and they would have their own separate state. However, in 1939, they changed their mind. And so this is where you have the White Paper. So this basically established that within the next 10 years, so by 1949 at the latest, there was going to be an independent Palestine, and you were going to have a Jewish homeland within this independent thing. So it's kind of, rather than there being a two-state solution, this is essentially the first inkling of a one-state solution, right? Where the Jews can have their own homeland, but there still would be an independent Palestine, and the British would withdraw. And also as well, within this white paper, it restricted the Jews to owning just 5% of the land. So by 1944, this figure kind of creeped up a little bit to 6% of the land. But where the Jews owned land was very kind of disproportionate, A, to their population, and B, across like the kind of country, right? So whereas in Jerusalem, for instance, where they made up 40% of the population, there they owned just 2% of the land. Whereas in Jaffa, where they had set up Tel Aviv, they made up 72% of the population, but they owned just 39% of the land. So as you can see, even though it's like 5 to 6% of the land that they own in terms of like the total area, actually when you break it down, they only have a big ownership in a handful of different places. Now with this, you can already start to see the beginning of the Arab habit of not realizing reality, right, and coming to terms with reality. Now what I mean by that is they're outnumbered, they're outgunned, they're not in a position to be able to equally negotiate, and yet still, even though this white paper restricted immigration, even though it said that there will eventually be an independent Palestine, even though it did all these kind of things as this kind of like a compromise between the two, it still was a thing where the Arabs said no, no, no. And the British obviously did this, yeah, because they had bigger things to worry about, right? Especially what was going on in Europe at the time. And they obviously just wanted peace within their colonies, so that's why they kind of did this. But still, during World War II, the Arabs actually allied themselves with Hitler, right? So with the Mufti of Jerusalem, he allied himself with Hitler, and both of them agreed on many anti-Semitic tropes, or rather, I should say anti-Jewish, because the Arabs technically are Semites as well. But still, that was something which many Jews still remembered, and that's something which even today is still remembered as a thing of, yeah, the Arabs can't really be negotiated with because they even sided with Hitler to destroy the Jews. Now, during World War II, it's a thing where 30,000 Palestinian Jews enlisted for the British Army, and you had 12,000 Palestinian Arabs who also did the same thing. And worldwide, you had 1.5 million Jews from all the different services of the different Allied armies, right, serving in that war. And so after the war, and after you'd seen all the devastation of the Holocaust, now these people becoming very, very impatient with the British, and they were like, we need a Jewish homeland to make sure that this never happens again. So now this is where you start to see Jewish terrorism against the British authorities. So between 1945 and 1947, you end up having a series of terrorist attacks, most notably the King David Hotel bombings, right, in 1946, which killed 91 people. So during this reign of terror, you end up having a total of 141 Brits who end up being killed, as well as 40 Jews who end up dying as well. So now the British, after all these years of administering the province, right, they basically were now sick of it, right? The Klimati government, the Labour government, which took over after the war, they just wanted to withdraw from India, they wanted to withdraw from Palestine, and basically what they did is they just said, right, the UN, you guys are now set up, you guys deal with this problem instead. And this is where the British withdrew. So the UN, they came together and they came up with a partition plan, which was a very uneven partition plan, especially based on where the populations were at the time, because basically what it did is it split the land 50-50, and actually, you know, the Jews only made up, as we can see, 31% of the population, and most of them were very much centered in a particular region. So it gave them far more land than they actually had control over, and which they actually were majority in. And this is perhaps why even Britain ended up abstaining from this decision. However, as we can see on the map here, the Arab nations were really opposed to this. And so as Israel was declaring its independence, these Arab armies were looming, and they decided that they were going to strangle the baby in its cradle and snuff out the last little hope of there being the creation of a state of Israel. So that's where we have to leave this video for now. Obviously, we'll cover this more in greater depth in the next video. But yeah, so if you like this video, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell button so you stay notified for when these other videos come out. And also as well, don't forget to check out our videos on this topic and many other topics as well. You won't be disappointed. And also, like we said, leave a comment in the comment section so that we know your thoughts on this, so you know where what we've missed out, etc. And just give your opinion on the conflict. Yeah, like which side is more to blame, which side is, you know, like less to blame, etc. As long as things are respectful, I've got no problem with that at all. But yeah, so that kind of covers the history of the Mandate of Palestine. And yeah, with that being said, have a great day and bye. So where we left off last time was with the UN Partition Plan of 1947. And within this partition plan, it obviously had a lot of issues. So whereas the Peel Commission Plan of 1937, which had the idea of dividing up the land between a Jewish state and an Arab state, that plan there was a lot more representative of the actual populations. However, this plan by the UN was not that at all. So whereas the Jews made up just 33% of the population, now by the UN they were going to be offered 56% of the land, which would include 49% of the population. And within that 56% of the land, 55% of the population there were going to be Jews, and the other 45 were going to be Arabs. So even in the so-called Jewish state, it still is a thing where the Jews are only barely making up a majority of the people there. Now, of course, in the Arab part, this was 99%, but still, it was not very reflective of it, because the Arabs, although they make up the majority, they make up 67% of the population of mandatory Palestine, they would only be given 43% of the land. And the remainder was going to be an international zone, which is where the city of Jerusalem was. Now, as a quick side note, the fact that this was proposed was mainly pushed for by the Vatican, yeah, because they and other religious organizations, they wanted Jerusalem, because it was sensitive to all the different faiths, they wanted that to be administered in an international zone, right? So just a little side note with regard to that. That's also part of the reason why the Vatican didn't recognize the state of Israel for many years afterwards. So of course the Arabs were infuriated by this, and this is what began the 1947 to 1948 civil war in Palestine. So the Arabs are fighting the Jews are fighting the Arabs, and on top of that, both sides are now fighting the British, who are caught in the middle. And that's something which we covered in like the previous video as well. So the British are kind of like, you know, they're caught in the middle, and they're just like, we want out of this. So of course, while this is going on, the tensions are really starting to build. And this is where America decided that they were going to withdraw their support for the partition plan, because the British had already abstained in this vote at the UN, and America now they could see all the violence that was happening, they were like, this perhaps isn't the best idea. However, the Arab League took this withdrawal of support as basically a green light to say that the nascent state of Israel, it can just be wiped out by us, and the Americans aren't going to do anything about it. And this is where you start to have the build-up of tensions even more so. Now, David Ben-Gurion, he was the future first prime minister of Israel. And what he did is he reorganized the Israeli forces. So he got the Haganah and the Irgun, who had been rival Jewish paramilitaries, and he formed them together to form the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF. So this is the Army of Israel. And what he did is he also imposed a compulsory conscription on all Jewish men and all Jewish women. So the entire population was now going to be mobilized for the defense of this new state. And also as well, something to note is that Golda Meir, who was later to become the Israeli Prime Minister, she also raised a bunch of funds from America, and they got support from other places as well, most notably from the Soviet bloc. So Joseph Stalin was very much in favor of the Zionist movement, and the Soviet Union at that time was in favor of it in general. And so what they did is they used their proxy in Czechoslovakia to send arms to Israel to be able to defend itself. So there's a huge shipment of arms to there, and this really helped the war effort. So on the 14th of May 1948, there ended up being a council of 10 people, and David Ben-Gurion was the deciding person in that vote. So there were 6 people who voted one way and 4 people voting another way, and that vote there was to do with the Declaration of Independence for Israel. So by just 6 votes out of 10, they end up deciding that Israel was going to be an independent state. And it was upon this that the Arab nations decided that they were going to strangle the baby in its cradle. There was not going to be a partition. There was not going to be the existence of a Jewish state. Not in any part of this region. There was going to be no compromise. Everything was going to be completely wiped out. So with the stakes being this high, this is when Ben Gurion said that there was going to be Plan Dalet, or Plan D. And within this plan, it's very controversial because there was an idea of, if they come across an Arab town or Arab settlement in general, if they offer resistance, these people are going to have their town destroyed and they are going to be deported. If, however, they surrender, then fine, yeah, they can, still exist within like this Jewish state. So this obviously led to the so-called Nakba, right, or the catastrophe in Arabic, which is where the Jews came in and any town that resisted, they just rounded the people up, deported them all and destroyed the town, and then later rebuilt it as being predominantly a Jewish settlement. So this obviously was very controversial, and it eventually would lead to 700,000 Arab refugees. But of course, as you have all the different forces which are now converging on this nation Israel, now it's a thing where they are having to struggle for, it's a life or death kind of thing, right? They don't have the choice about, should we allow these people here in it, like if we can't trust them. It was really touch and go as to whether they survive or not. And actually, if they hadn't had this arms shipment from Czechoslovakia, like we said, it's unlikely that they ever would have won to begin. So by some miracle, in spite of everything, they were able to drive all the forces out. And it wasn't just 56% of the land that they ended up having control over, it was now 78% of the land, right? And this obviously was huge. No one expected that Israel was going to be able to pull this off, and yet somehow they did. But still, they had many, many problems. And also, it was the fact of, during this conflict, right, this is the Israeli War of Independence, which obviously goes by many different names, but there was a decision made where Ben Gurion wanted the IDF to go and liberate Jerusalem. However, the military strategists overrode him and said that they were going to go south into the southern region, which is where the Negev desert is. Now, you might on the face of it go, why did they do that? And the reason they did that is because Israel needed strategic depth. So this is the idea of needing buffer zones, right? So basically, the more land that you have, the more difficult it is when an invading army is coming in. So it makes more sense for you to take as much territory as possible in order to kind of defend your heartland. So whereas Jerusalem was obviously strategically important and obviously very symbolically important, the Negev desert, even though hardly anyone lived there, was actually going to be much more valuable for Israel to have control over than if it was the other way around. So that was something which ended up being decided. And of course, this had very long-term ramifications. So now you have a situation whereby Israel's borders as such are now being drawn, and this is along the so-called armistice line, or the kind of green line, which was decided in 1949. And this is what people kind of say is the borders of it, but it's not really borders, because no Arab state recognized Israel's right to exist, and it wasn't actually a peace deal, it was just a ceasefire line, right? So it's a temporary pausing of military action. So there can be no peace really when you are still surrounded by people who want you completely destroyed. And there was no Arab state because Egypt had control over Gaza and West Bank was controlled by Jordan. So Israel in its early years had many different issues to contend with. So first of all, you had 700,000 new Jewish immigrants coming from all over the world to settle there, many of whom could not speak the same language because they came from so many different places. And also within those 700,000, 260,000 of them were Jews who had fled from Arab countries because of persecution or just expulsion, right? So whereas we talk about the Nakba and of 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who were kicked out of that land, within like the different Arab neighboring states, there were 260,000 of them who ended up having to flee. So you had all of those issues as well. And then on top of that, you still have about 10% of the population, so 156,000 Arabs living within this new state of Israel. So how are they going to deal with all these issues? How is Israel going to actually survive to the end of the next decade? This was the things which the Israeli leadership had to deal with, and I think that they dealt with it in a really brilliant way. First of all, they made the official languages of Israel Hebrew and Arabic. So of course, the use of Arabic was used to placate the Arabs living within Israel, but also Hebrew was used to basically say that, look, all these Jews who are coming from all different places in the world, this is going to be our common language. This is the language which everyone needs to learn, which everyone needs to speak. And this is how we're going to build a pluralistic nation state, right? From all these different identities, all these different places, this is how we're going to build it. So now you can start to see how the forming of Israel is very difficult in those early years. You know, you had 10 years of austerity between 1949 and 1959. So it went through a lot of hardship, but still it turned out to be worth it in the end. And Israel ended up outperforming all of its Arab neighbors. So as you can see on the screen now with this graph, you can see that the GDP per capita of Israel continually went up, whereas with the different Arab states, it was much lower down and it kind of stayed at a much lower level in general. So Israel in those early days still had many different things to contend with, but still they were able to overcome them all. And the most notable thing of all as well is that the Arab Israelis, right, they were given full citizenship rights, right from the get-go. So even though they were under military rule from 1948 to 1966, they still had the right to vote, they still had the right to sit in the Knesset, they still had the right to form their own political parties, and also many of them decided that they were going to volunteer for the IDF. So that's something to really note, is that even though it was a Jewish state, it was still very pluralistic and it was still upholding the initial idea which was put forward by the Balfour Declaration, that there would be the respect for the different religious minorities within this new Jewish state. And also as well, something which we should touch on is the fact that they also had the benefit of having reparations. So we've covered this more in our video to do with the history of reparations. Definitely go and check that video out. But the long and the short of it with regard to this case here is that in 1952, West Germany gave 3 billion marks to Israel over the period of the next 14 years. And this money was used to help rebuild Israel and to make it the prosperous, developed country which it is today. So of course they got a lot of benefits from this, but even in spite of this, they still had to innovate. They still had to try their best, to overcome the challenges which they were facing. So the money alone wasn't what made it. It was the fact of how they used that money to make Israel rich and to make it prosperous and to make it strong. So of course the picture for Israel looks quite rosy. However, it's much less rosy with regard to the Arabs, both in Palestine and also in the neighboring regions. And the reason for this, first of all, talking about so-called Palestine, right, is that there was no idea of Palestinian nationalism before 1967, not in any concrete sense. And the reason for this is because the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and it was actually incorporated within the Kingdom of Jordan in the Jericho Conference of 1948. And Gaza was actually incorporated within Egypt. So they had set up like a client state in 1949, which was called the All-Palestinian Protectorate. However, this was kind of just basically a puppet of Egypt. And actually in 1959, this was completely dissolved when you had the United Arab Republic. So this, for those who don't know, this is when Egypt and Syria formed together to become one state. So during this time, Gaza was put under essentially Egyptian military rule. However, the Palestinians at this time were not complaining. There was no kind of push for we want our own state, etc., etc. They were quite happy to be ruled by the Egyptians and by the Jordanians. And in 1964, when the PLO was set up, this is the Palestine Liberation Organization, when this was set up, it wasn't about them getting independence from Egypt and from Jordan. This was about having liberation from the state of Israel. So, they were pushing for Israel to be completely destroyed, and in that way, Palestine would be liberated as they so saw it. So you can see in this conflict, even though that was very unfairly kind of dealt with, right, in the sense of like the Jews perhaps shouldn't have been offered as much land as they were in the partition plan, you can see how after the dust has settled, the Arabs still haven't kind of moved on from it, right? They haven't just kind of like accepted what's actually happened, and they're still pushing for every single inch of that land to be theirs and for the Jews to have none of that land. So in 1956, you end up having the Suez Crisis. So this is where Israel teamed up with Britain and France to try and take the Suez Canal off of Egypt. Now, of course, due to American and Soviet pressures, this ended up being reversed. But of course, it left a very bitter taste in the mouth of General Nasser and the entire Arab world. And so tensions continued to build up throughout the late 50s and into the 1960s. So in 1966, there was lots of things that happened, right? So first of all, France, which up to this point had been the chief arms supplier of Israel, Charles de Gaulle, the president at the time, he decided that they were going to step away from the Middle East. So a few years before, they'd been kicked out of Algeria, and now he basically wanted to pull France out of its commitments in the Middle East, and so they were like, right, we're not selling you arms anymore. So at this point here, in 1966, this is where America reluctantly stepped in and they became the chief arms supplier of the Israelis. So up until this point, they had a very hands-off kind of approach to Israel. They hadn't really wanted to get involved in the whole conflict, but they end up stepping in only to maintain a balance of power within the Middle East, right? So if France isn't selling weapons, America reluctantly end up selling them weapons. And also as well, within 1966, this is where the Arab Israelis, they now had their military rule completely lifted from them. So this marks a real turning point in Arab-Israeli relationships within the state of Israel, because now there was no question of them being second-class citizens. They were now full Israeli citizens, with equal rights and equal protection under the law. However, in spite of all this, the tensions were still building, the war drums were still beating, and this is where you have in 1967, you end up having the 6-Day War. Now, we've covered this in more depth in our other videos, so definitely go and check that out. You'll learn a lot from it there. But with regard to this video, we have to end it here. But definitely stay tuned for the next video, where we're going to be covering what happened after the 67 war. So, that being said, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also as well, check out our many other videos on many different topics, so you will not be disappointed if you go and check these videos out. And once you do, don't forget, obviously, to share them with people who have similar interests to you, because that will really help the channel to grow, and also you will have a benefit as well, and who knows, you might even have some new friends for the new year and beyond, right? So, that being said, have a great day, and bye. Now, where we left off in the last video was in 1967 with the 6-Day War. Now, for the sake of this video, we're not going to go through all that because we've already covered that in a recent video, so I highly recommend that you check that out. But for this video, we're going to focus more on the aftermath of the 6-Day War. So first of all, with regard to Israel, as we said in that video, it needed strategic depth. And so that's what they got in the space of these 6 days. So within these 6 days, they managed to extend their strategic depth by 300 kilometers in the south, 60 kilometers to the east, and 20 kilometers to the north, as well as the fact that they increased their total territory by a factor of almost 4. However, this came at the cost of acquiring almost 1 million extra hostile Arabs. So the question was, what to do with them and how to achieve a lasting peace. So the Israelis, in response to this, they set up a military government, and this basically had control over the occupied territories, and this was within accordance to the 4th Geneva Convention. However, East Jerusalem was an exception to this, and the reason for this is because Israel completely annexed the territory for itself. Now, I actually happen to have a kippah here, which was given to me when I visited the Western Wall in 2014. And the reason I went to Israel/Palestine was because I wanted to see for myself both sides of the argument. I wanted to speak to Israelis and Palestinians and to see the land and see the people for myself, rather than just either reading it in a history book or else just looking at different media outlets, which are obviously going to have their own biases. Now, the reason why I mention all this is because 1967 was a pivotal year for the city of Jerusalem, and that's because for the first time in 19 years, it was now open to people of all faiths. Why was this? Because when the Jordanians had control over West Bank, they actually banned all Israeli citizens, be they Jew or Arab, from entering there to go to any of the holy sites, with the only exception being Christians being allowed to visit the town of Bethlehem. So this meant that the Western Wall and all the other religious sites within Jerusalem were off limits to any Israeli citizens. But in 1967, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, he visited the Western Wall, and he himself began to dismantle the road sign which the Jordanians had placed there, and now it was open, and the whole city was open, and the whole of the West Bank was open for people of all faiths to go and visit their holy sites. However, this came at the cost of the so-called Moroccan Quarter. So this is a very historic part of the old city of Jerusalem. However, this ended up being completely demolished by the Israeli authorities, and this was the reason why there is a plaza there now in front of the Western Wall. So this was an area which had predominantly Muslim Arabs that were living there, and yeah, they obviously were very, very annoyed at this. So anyway, you'd expect after the 6-Day War, you expect all the Arab states surrounding Israel to basically be like, okay, we got beaten, we accept that you guys win, we accept that you guys exist, let's just make peace and let's just end this, right? Wrong. That did not happen, because in August 1967, you had the famous Khartoum resolution at the Arab League summit of that year. And this is where they outlined the famous 3 no's. This is no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. And then also within that year, this is where you had the famous UN Resolution 242. And this outlined that Israel, in order to achieve peace, had to do the so-called trade of land for peace. So this is where Israel ended up offering the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and they offered the Golan Heights back to Syria. Although both sides are obviously, because of this Khartoum resolution, completely rejected this, and as a result, they didn't end up getting those territories back. But while Israel was happy to offer the land to Egypt and to Syria, they were not happy to offer land to the Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank. And the reason being is because Gaza had been controlled by Egypt and the West Bank had been controlled by Jordan, and they denied access and authority to both of these places, and also denied the existence of a Palestinian state. So this is part of the reason why it ended up being stalled, and the reason for this is twofold. First of all, to do with security concerns, because as we've just mentioned with regard to strategic depth, and then second of all, to do with the beginning of the settler movement. So this began in 1968, and obviously over the years it has continued to grow ever since, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just to let you know, this is part of the reason why peace negotiations kind of end up stalling. Now, in reaction to this, you end up having another aliyah, and this was mainly to do with the Arab world, but also to do with the Soviet bloc. So first of all, talk about the Arab world. Obviously, as a result of this, you had many, many people, in particular from Morocco and other places, who end up fleeing to Israel. So Morocco, as an example, throughout the 1960s, 130,000 Jews end up emigrating from Morocco to Israel. But on top of that, in the 1970s, you end up having 163,000 Jews migrating from the Soviet Union alone to Israel, never mind all the other places within the Eastern Bloc. And this was partly as a result of the fact that the Eastern Bloc within the Cold War had now decided that they were siding with the Arabs, whereas the West was now aligning themselves more with the state of Israel. So as a result of this, coupled with the latent anti-Semitism within the Eastern Bloc nations, this is why many Jews end up fleeing during this time. And then later in the 1980s, you end up having many Jews fleeing from Ethiopia as well. So there was another area with regard to that. So during this time, from 1967 to 1994, Israel's population almost doubled. So it went from 2.78 million in 1967, and by 1994, it had risen to 5.5 million. And this is partly as a result of all the different immigrants who have fled into Israel during this time from all around the world. So of course, Israel now controlling the West Bank and Gaza meant that they were now coming into conflict even more directly with many of the Palestinians. And so in response to this, the Palestinians started to launch many different attacks against Israel. So first of all, in 1970, you end up having skirmishes between the Palestinians and the Kingdom of Jordan. And this was an attempt by the Palestinians, because obviously you had many refugees there. There was an attempt by the PLO to overthrow the monarchy there. And so in response to this, the King of Jordan expelled the PLO from Jordan. And so this is where the center of focus of the PLO shifted from Jordan to southern Lebanon. And of course, this ended up being a contributing factor to the Lebanese civil war, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then also with regard to the Palestinians, this is where they started to launch many different terror attacks against the Israelis. Most notably in the Munich Olympic Games of 1972, and this is where they captured 11 Israeli athletes, and they held them hostage, and eventually they ended up killing them all. And then a few years later, you had Operation Entebbe in 1976. And this is where you had a plane load of people, so 106 Israeli citizens who were held hostage in Uganda by PLO terrorists. And then, of course, these people end up being freed by Mossad. And this is covered in the film Raid on Entebbe, so I highly recommend that you watch that film. So this kind of gives you an idea of this escalating tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians are responding to this by enacting acts of terror against Israeli citizens. But during this time, there's something which very fundamentally shifted. And what it is the view of the international left against Israel. And what I mean by this is more covered in our video on why people support Israel and Palestine, so definitely check that video out. But the long and the short of it with regard to this element here is that the international left, before 1967, was sympathetic towards Israel because the left tends to support the underdog in any kind of situation. So before, Israel was weak, it was surrounded by Arab nations, and so it was seen that the Arabs, they were the ones who were the oppressors, and Israel were the oppressed. However, 1967 showed Israel to be strong. It had completely dominated its neighbours, and now it seemed that they were the ones who were the oppressors. And therefore, the shift of focus ended up going away from Israel and end up being more towards the Palestinians. So now they were seen as the victims, they were seen as the oppressed, and this is why public opinion in the West started to shift away from Israel and towards Palestine. So just to give you a little idea of that, just to explain why people's views on Israel today is seen as such a controversial topic in the West, this is the roots of it here. And then on top of that, you end up having the Yom Kippur War of 1973. So this was an attempt by Egypt and Syria to reverse the gains that Israel had made in 1967. They were obviously unsuccessful with regards to that, and Israel was able to push them back. However, this attack, which was pretty much a surprise attack, they didn't expect this at all, and it took place obviously on Yom Kippur, which is one of the holiest days in the calendar for the Jews. So this led to two reactions. First of all, America, which up to this point had kind of stayed out of the conflict, and as you can see on the graph here, they hadn't really got involved in the conflict up to this point. But afterwards, they started to really ramp up their military support for Israel, and this is within the context of the Cold War. So Israel had proved itself to be a reliable Western ally, and the Arabs had become more and more pro-Soviet. So this is why American aid really started to ramp up during this time in order to counterbalance the aid that the Soviets were giving to the Arab countries. And also within Israel itself, it led to a huge political shift. And this is where you end up seeing the Likud party, led by Prime Minister Begin, start to really take off. So in 1977, this is where the Likud party finally took over from the Labour Party, which had been dominant up to that period. And now they, who were pretty much a right-wing conservative nationalist party, they now were the ones who were in office, and they were the ones who were driving the policy. In particular, with the settlements, which the Labour Party had kind of tacitly supported beforehand, but the Likud party was very much in favour of it now. But in 1977, it wasn't just that Likud ended up coming to power in those elections. In 1977, something also happened that was just absolutely remarkable, and that is that Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, who 4 years ago had gone to war against Israel, now, for the first time, he was coming and he wanted peace with Israel. And so what ended up beginning now was the Camp David Accords, and this is where Israel and Egypt agreed that the two states would recognize each other, the two states would have peace, and that over the period of the next 5 years, Israel in stages would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula and give all of the territory back to Egypt. So this is in accordance with the UN Resolution 242. So Israel was indeed trading land for peace. However, this did not come at no cost at all, because Egypt ended up being kicked out of the Arab League from 1979 to 1989 as a result of this, and also Anwar Sadat in 1981 ended up being assassinated as a result of this. So in my opinion, Anwar Sadat is one of the bravest politicians of the modern era, but still, even in spite of the tragedy, he took the very first steps in the long road towards peace. However, the same could not be said for Syria, same could not be said for Lebanon, nor could it be said for the Palestinians. And so reaction to this, Israel, first of all, annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, because they was like, right, if you're not going to sit and negotiate with us like the Egyptians did, you can forget about getting the Golan Heights back. And then with regard to the Palestinians, because of their continued intransigence, what Israel did under the Likud party is they ramped up the number of settlers. So by 1983, you end up having 100,000 Israeli settlers in Palestinian territories, Although it should be noted that 76,000 of these were actually in East Jerusalem, which, as we've said, was annexed by Israel. So it kind of counts, but doesn't really count as such. And then with regard to Lebanon, in 1982, Israel ended up invading them. Now, the Lebanese civil war is an incredibly complicated thing. It took me hours and hours to sift through all the information for this to see what was relevant for this video and what wasn't. But cut a long story short, what had happened as a result of the PLO being kicked out of Jordan is that, like we said, they moved their base of operation to southern Lebanon. And southern Lebanon, at the time, ended up being referred to informally as Fatah land. And this is because Fatah was the dominant faction within the PLO at the time. So, long story short, southern Lebanon was pretty much in the hands of the PLO, completely independent of control by Beirut. So in the early years of the civil war, there had been a few border skirmishes between Israel and the PLO who were operating out of southern Lebanon. But in June of 1982, Israel had had enough and they decided that they were going to invade. So by late August 1982, the PLO leader, who was Yasser Arafat, he ended up having to flee from there and he set up shop in Tunisia instead. However, just 15 days later, the Christian president of Lebanon, who was Bashir Gamal, he ended up being assassinated. Now, he was actually in the process of recognizing Israel and setting up a peace deal with the Israelis, but he obviously ended up being assassinated. And so in response to this, you end up having the Christian phalangists, so this was a faction within the civil war there. And what they did in retaliation is that they went to two Palestinian refugee camps, which was Sabra and Shatila, and they massacred between 460 and 3,500 Palestinian refugees. Now, there ended up being a lot of controversy with regard to this, partly because Israeli forces were actually very much near to these camps, and there ended up being a debate about how much they were actually involved. And so this ended up sparking a huge amount of controversy and a huge amount of protest, not just in the Arab world, but actually within Israel itself. So this ended up seeing the largest ever protests in Israel's history, which took place in the city of Tel Aviv, and there were 400,000 Israelis who came out onto the streets to protest this massacre, which represented about 10% of Israel's population at the time. So, the largest ones in all of Israeli history to protest the killing of Palestinians. And what ended up happening as a result of this the year after is you end up having a public inquiry, and as a result of this, the defense minister, Ariel Sharon, was barred from ever holding that office again. Although we should mention that obviously he ended up becoming the prime minister a few years later, but either way, he wasn't barred from holding that office, but anyway. But in spite of all that, in spite of all the controversy and stuff, Israel decided that by 1985, they had had enough of the Lebanese civil war. They pacified the Palestinians who were there enough, and so they end up withdrawing. However, during all this time with the Palestinians, they obviously had been occupied. So how were they feeling throughout this time? Well, in spite of the record economic growth which had taken place during that time, so just to give you an indication of this, as you can see on the screen now, in 1950, the GDP per capita for the Palestinians was $1,549. By 1967, which was the beginning of the year of Israeli occupation, it had risen to $2,852. And by 1984, which was again just 17 years afterwards, it had risen to $4,807. So as you can see, it's absolute record growth under Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza. And yet still, many of the Palestinians were obviously not happy with this. And so this caused, in 1987, the so-called First Intifada. So Intifada in Arabic means the shuddering or the shaking off. So this was seen as the shaking off of the Israeli occupation. And within the 6 years that it lasted from 1987 to 1993, there ended up being 200 Israelis who were killed from this, and almost 2,000 Palestinians who ended up getting killed as well. Although, what's complicated with regard to this is that of the 2,000 Palestinians that ended up being killed, there's a huge debate as to how many of them were killed by Israelis and how many of them were killed by other Palestinians. So at the low end of it, there's 360 of them who were killed by other Palestinians, and on the high end, it's 1,000 of them. So potentially, you could have had a situation where almost half of the people who end up being killed in this were killed by other Palestinians. And the reason for this is because many people were seen as informants for the IDF and the other Israeli intelligence services. So that explains why so many of them were being killed. But again, we will never fully figure out what the actual total figure is. But still, in spite of all this terror, this led the Israelis and the Palestinians to, for the first time, start to come together. So in the Madrid conference of 1991, two things ended up happening. First of all, the UN ended up revoking the decision that was made in 1975, which had classed Zionism as a form of racism. But also within that conference, this was the very first time where you had Israeli delegates and Palestinian delegates being together in the same room to negotiate peace. And so 2 years later, the famous Oslo Accords ended up happening. So this is Oslo 1. And this saw Israeli and Palestinian leaders come together and shake hands and start working out a path towards peace. So as a result of these talks, the Palestinian National Authority, or what would eventually become the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, they end up being set up, and this would establish self-governance and self-determination for the Palestinians living in Gaza and West Bank. So now, for the very first time, the Palestinians would be able to govern their own territories, and over time, this would lead to Palestinian independence, provided that they made peace and recognized the state of Israel. So in 1994, there ended up being 3 Nobel Prizes that were handed out, and this was to the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, the Israeli Foreign Minister Peres, and also to the head of the PLO, who was Yasser Arafat. So now it seemed that there was going to be peace, and then also within that year of 1994, Jordan ended up recognizing Israel. So now, within this period that we spoke about from 1967 to 1994, a lot has changed. You've now gone from a situation whereby Israel's neighbors are trying to destroy it, and now we've gone to a situation whereby on its western border, Egypt has recognized her, and now on her eastern border, Jordan has recognized her. So there's now peace between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. However, the same could not be said for Lebanon, which obviously tried to recognize Israel and they end up assassinating their president. Syria, which even to this day has made no attempt at trying to make peace with Israel or to recognize her. And with regard to the Palestinians, let's just say there's a reason why I left it at 1994, because I could have gone up to the year 2000 as I had originally planned when I began the series. But I think that 1994 represents a real turning point where peace was on the cusp, and then things went different, right? So that's what we're going to cover more in the next video. So if you like this video, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also check out our many other videos, and also check out the other videos within this playlist if you've missed it so far. But yeah, so with that, we have to kind of end the video, and in the meantime, have a great day, and bye. Now, where we left off last time was in 1994. So this was just the year after the famous Oslo Accords in 1993. And 1994 was also the same year where you had 3 Nobel Prize winners. So you ended up having Prime Minister Rabin from Israel, you ended up having Foreign Minister Peres from Israel, and also Yasser Arafat of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And also in 1994, this is when Jordan, for the very first time, ended up recognizing the state of Israel. So it seemed after many, many decades of conflict between Israel and the Arabs, it seemed that now finally, now it is the 1990s, that they were coming to some sort of peace. Like we said in the last video, 1994 represents a real turning point, because that was the last time when it looked as if there was actually going to be peace, and everything that happened after that period saw a sudden shift. It saw a kind of regression back to how things had been before. So that's what we're going to explore in this video, and that's why I've labelled it as uncertainty, because the period before they were seeking peace, now the whole peace process is in a limbo. So that's what we're going to explore in terms of the actual history of this period. So Jordan wasn't the only country that ended up recognising Israel during this time. In the late 90s, as a result of the Oslo Peace Accords and also the end of the Cold War, now many states which had been hostile to Israel beforehand now started to recognise it. Although still within the Arab world and the Muslim world in general, this was still not really the norm, and there were many countries that still didn't recognize Israel. In particular, Lebanon and Syria, which obviously still border Israel. But still, on its western flank and on its eastern flank now, it had Egypt and it had Jordan recognized it, and it seemed that Palestine was also recognizing it. So in 1995, you ended up having Prime Minister Rabin and Yasser Arafat come together once again, and this was the so-called Israel-Palestinian Interim Agreement, also known as Oslo II. So there's many different things within Oslo II, but the main thing that it worked out was how there were going to be an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and from the West Bank, in particular with regard to West Bank. So West Bank was divided into 3 different sections. So you had Area A, Area B, and Area C. So Area A is where the Palestinians had full control, and this was initially going to be just 3% of the West Bank. Next, you were going to have Area B, which was going to initially be between 23 and 25% of the West Bank, which would have basically shared control. So you'd have Israeli security, but you'd have Palestinian administration. And then finally, you're going to have Section C, and this was initially going to be between 72 and 74% of the West Bank, and this was going to be under full Israeli control. Although it should be noted that within these areas, the Palestinian population was very, very low. So what was going to be done was that over the period of the next 5 years, so by the year 2000, you were going to have in stages a withdrawal of the Israelis from the West Bank and from Gaza. So much in the same way as the Israelis had already withdrawn from Egypt between 1977 and 1982, you were going to have the same kind of thing of them withdraw in stages. However, by 2013, the figures hadn't really changed that much. So as we said, initially it was going to be 3% of the West Bank was going to be under Area A. By 2013, this had fallen to just 18%. Area B, which was initially at 23 to 25% of the West Bank, fell to just 22% by 2013. And then finally, Section C, which was initially going to be between 72 and 74%, that had gone down to just 63%. So as you can see, there's been a slight withdrawal, but you're talking about a period of, almost 20 years. So what was the cause of this? Why is it that Israel still has control over so much of the West Bank? Well, that is partly as a result of the events which happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So that's what we're going to look into right now. So although the Palestinians had agreed that they were going to abstain from terror, and the PLO had taken out the part of their covenant which called for the expulsion of all Jews from the former Mandate territory, still many people in Israel were very annoyed, in particular the ultra-Zionists. So these are far-right people within Israel, and what they basically wanted was all the land, right? They didn't want to have any compromise, didn't even want to really have Arabs within Israel at all. So these people here who are on the extremes, they were very annoyed at Prime Minister Rabin. And as a result of this, on the 4th of November 1995, Rabin ended up being assassinated by one of these ultra-Zionists. So this represented a huge tragedy within both Israeli and Palestinian history, because it marked the beginning of the end of the peace process. Because what ended up happening the following year is that President Perez ended up calling for an early election, and this election, which was actually going to be the first one in which Israelis could directly elect a prime minister, they ended up electing Benjamin Netanyahu, aka Bibi. So Benjamin Netanyahu, he's been in and out of the premiership. At the moment, actually, he still is the Prime Minister of Israel. He's newly been elected, but still, he's been about in the game for a long time. And so when he first came to office in 1995 under the Likud party, this represented a huge shift in how Israel viewed the Palestinian conflict. Because whereas the Labour Party had wanted to negotiate more and were kind of more in favour of making concessions to the Arabs, for Likud, they were on basically having a much tougher stance against them. So when it came to them committing acts of terror, the Likud party wasn't there for negotiation. They were on cracking down on the Palestinians who perpetrated it. And actually during this time, although the PLO had said that they were going to abstain from terror, the terror attacks on Israel increased during this time. So actually it bolstered Likud and it actually bolstered Bibi because it reinforced what they were saying, that actually, even though we've signed all these peace deals, the terror is still continuing. We're still actually not any closer to peace, and therefore the Palestinians can't be trusted. So now we're starting to see that in spite of everything which has been done, the Palestinians are now no longer being trusted by the Israelis. So in September of 1996, you end up having a series of riots taking place, and this was as a result of Israel deciding that it was going to build a tunnel underneath the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And this ended up obviously leading to a huge backlash. And also within that same year, you end up having Hamas launching a series of terror attacks against Israel, as well as Hezbollah, who were based out of southern Lebanon, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So as a result of this ended up leading to the Hebron Protocol. So this is where the Israelis decided that they were going to withdraw from 80% of Hebron in 1997. So 2 years after this, Ehud Barak, who was from the Labour Party, he ended up getting elected again. So Bibi was out of office now. So again, it seemed that with the Labour Party being in, they were going to start moving more and more towards peace. And also it should be noted that the Supreme Court in Israel actually decided that the interrogation of Palestinians and the torture of the Palestinian prisoners was illegal under Israeli law. So that's just something to note here, which obviously had a lot of controversy at the time, but still that's something which was actually enacted. So the following year, in the year 2000, this is where you're having the Camp David Summit. So this is the last summit in which Bill Clinton would supervise over. And within this is where Israel end up making some proposals to Yasser Arafat again. So Prime Minister Barak, he actually offered that 73% of the West Bank was going to be handed over to the Palestinians and 100% of Gaza was going to be handed over. And over the period of the next 10 to 25 years, so this would be within context, the year 2010 to the year 2025, they were going to actually hand over not just 73% of West Bank, but actually it was going to go up to 92%. However, Yasser Arafat rejected this. And amongst the Palestinians, he ended up getting 68% support for walking away from this proposal. However, Ehud Barak, he ended up getting just 25% support amongst the Israeli public for pushing for this thing, because it was clear that Israel was making concessions and yet it was not being reciprocated. So then in the following year, you end up having the Taba Summit of 2001. And in this case here, Barak actually offered that Israel was going to withdraw from 97% of West Bank. So they were going to have 100% of Gaza, and also they're going to have 97% of West Bank. And there's actually also going to be land swaps between the Israelis and the Palestinians, So where there was land within Israel that was predominantly Arab, if those places wanted to, then those places would be handed over to independent Palestine. And yet still, Yasser Arafat rejected this. So now you can start to see a pattern, which is almost the spirit of cartoon, which we spoke about in previous videos, where it's like, no, no, no. So at this point now, the Israeli public are basically getting really fed up with this. And also around this time, there was real trouble brewing. Because in September of the year 2000, you end up having former Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who ended up visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So we mentioned him in the last video, and he was caught up within the massacres which took place within the Lebanese war. But now he was kind of making a push to get into Israeli politics. And it ended up causing such a backlash, just him going up onto the Temple Mount and praying, that this led to the Second Intifada, which was even deadlier than the First Intifada. And this saw 3,000 Palestinians dead, and it saw 1,000 Israelis dead by the year 2005. So as you can see on the chart here, it had a huge impact on the economy of both Israel and Palestine. But what's notable is actually it seemed to have a much bigger impact on the economy of Palestine. And the reason for this is because the suicide bombings which Hamas was perpetrating against Israeli citizens end up leading to huge crackdowns, end up leading to huge airstrikes, and also end up leading to construction of the Western Wall. So this is the security wall which Israel built between itself and West Bank. So it cuts through many different parts of West Bank. And actually, when I went to visit Israel and Palestine myself, and I went to the city of Bethlehem and I went to Jericho, the Palestinian tour guides we had there, the guy actually started tearing up himself because it's very difficult for him to see his family on the other side of that wall. But in spite of that, even the jihadists had to admit that it was very effective. So what you can see from the stats here is before the wall was set up in the year 2003, you end up having 73 suicide bombings, which killed 452 Israelis. However, by the year 2006, you end up having just 12, and this only killed 64 people. So you can see from the construction of the wall how it ended up having a huge impact on reducing the level of terror which got into Israel. But at the same time, it obviously impacted the Palestinian economy because, they were very dependent on their trade with Israel. So if you have this huge security wall, it means it's harder for people in West Bank who are actually trying to make a living to actually do business with Israel. But of course, by now, as a result of all these things, Ariel Sharon, he ended up being elected in 2001. So his premiership lasted from 2001 to 2006. And actually, within his premiership, he ended up doing something which no one expected. It was something which he even had campaigned against in the election. And this was the disengagement of Israel from Gaza. So in the year 2005, he decided unilaterally that Israel was going to not just pull out all of its troops, but was going to forcibly remove all the settlers from Gaza. So there was about 8,000 Israeli settlers living within Gaza, and this ended up causing a huge controversy within Israel. And actually, I'd highly recommend that you go and check out a video which was done by the channel Unpacked. That channel is absolutely great. I really recommend that you check them out and subscribe to them. And actually, they've been very helpful to my own channel, but that's a different story. But their video on the disengagement of Israel from Gaza really kind of gives you an illustration of what ended up happening, because what ended up happening is they withdrew, and rather than the Palestinians just being like, yes, thank you for doing that, we really appreciate that. Instead, what happening is the number of terror attacks increased. Hamas, the following year, in the year 2006, ended up being elected. And actually, this was the first and, to date, the last free, fair Palestinian election, because there hasn't been one since. Basically, Hamas ended up coming to power. Fatah, who had been in charge before, they end up having a civil war with Hamas. And that's why, the Palestinian Authority, it has actually had no legitimate authority since 2006. So basically now, Gaza is controlled by Hamas, and Hamas is focused more on firing rockets into Israel than they are on having peace or the welfare of their citizens. And actually, another thing that Hamas pushed for was basically saying that there would be no more peace negotiations, there would be no more recognition of Israel, and also, just to throw a little one in there as well, the Holocaust was a conspiracy. So, as you can see, this is kind of the reversal of everything that Yasser Arafat had agreed just a few years before. So now the Israeli public were kind of seeing, actually, you know what, this is not working. If we withdraw from the place, and this is the response that we end up getting, we're not stupid enough to do this again with the West Bank. And on top of that, you're not having increased attacks from Hezbollah, and you're not having increased funding of Hezbollah and Hamas from Iran, who now start to see Israel as the little Satan. And they started building up their attempt at a nuclear program, which Israel has had to since scupper. And also, this is where you end up having in 2006, you end up having once again Israel going into southern Lebanon to crush militants there. So, it seems almost like deja vu at this point, Israel having to intervene in southern Lebanon as a result of the Palestinian refugees who were still living there, even decades after they first fled. So you can see this being the continuation of a problem. It's this continuation of a cycle of violence, and there's no real way of getting out of it, no matter what the Israelis do. But like we said in the last video, what was happening now was with the international left. So the international left in the West, they were basically now more and more on the side of the Palestinians. So even in spite of the terror attacks, they basically said it's Israel's fault for occupying the land. They started to see Israel more and more as the bully. They started to take the side of the Palestinians, regardless of whether they were in the right or wrong morally. And now you start to see the demonization of Israel. Then also as well within the 1990s and early 2000s, you're having a shift away from what had always been beforehand, which was a focus on Zionism versus Arab nationalism. And now it was becoming more and more a religious conflict, where you're having the ultra-Orthodox Jews versus the kind of militant Islamists. So now the conflict was becoming more and more irrational and less rational. And now it's becoming even more difficult because you can't compromise when you think that God is on your side and stuff. So now the conflict was more centered around what was happening within the Temple Mount in the old city in Jerusalem. And on top of that, because it's now the war on terror, you're having evangelical Christians within America, and they're funding Israel even more. And then on top of that, you're having many people from the Muslim world, in particular from Saudi Arabia, pouring funds in to support more and more militant Islamism within this region. as well as additional funding from the Iranian government. So now by the year 2009, where Bibi was once again elected into office, you're not having kind of a stagnation of the situation. So whereas the year 2000s has started off very, very positively for the region, now by the end of the decade, it seemed that it was a unsolvable, intractable kind of a conflict which neither side could escape from. So in 2010, you're not having the blockade of Gaza, and this was as a result of, again, Hamas using humanitarian aid to funnel that into creating rockets to fire into Israel. So then as a result of that, Israel and Egypt blockaded Gaza, which has led to the humanitarian crisis which you see at the moment. But still, there's no solution. Why is there no solution? Again, it goes back to the spirit of Khartoum, this intransigence of not recognizing what the situation is. So let me just say this very kind of clearly and very bluntly. Israel has the strongest military within the Middle East. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel, if it wanted to, could wipe Palestine off the face of the map and could completely destroy the Palestinian people. But it hasn't. Instead, it sits down with people and tries to make peace with them. Now, given the circumstances, it would be rational, regardless of whether you want to say it's moral or not, it would be rational for the Palestinians to come down and say, okay, cool, right. They're giving us something. It may not be 100% what we want, but they're giving us something. If they're giving us 100% of Gaza and they're giving us 97% of the West Bank, maybe we should just take it because we're not going to get a better offer than this, and they actually don't even need to give us an offer in the first place. But instead, because of this all or nothing mindset, it meant that that's the reason why there is no state of Palestine today. That's the reason why this conflict is continuing. And actually, what you're seeing in the rest of the region is state by state, most people are now coming to terms with the fact that Israel exists. And so this is why Israel is starting to build in its international clout. It's starting to have many states within the Muslim world start to recognize it. And the Palestinians are more and more being sidelined because their interest of continuing this conflict is actually detrimental to the interest of others within the region as well. And this is actually borne out in polling. So in the year 2002, they did a poll for both Israelis and Palestinians. And what they found is that 72% of both supported the creation of a two-state solution based on 1967 borders. However, fast forward to 2021, and you can see that it's completely flipped. So what you see now is this 39% of Palestinians are in favour of it, and just 41% of Jewish Israelis in favour of it. And the reason why I specify Jewish Israelis is because Arab Israelis are the only demographic within the region which are still hopeful for a two-state solution. But with regard to Israel, the situation, I think, is starting to head more and more into a situation where they're becoming less and less willing to even contemplate the idea. And part of the reason for this is because of an increase of migration from different places around the world. So the Jewish population within Israel is still climbing up and up and up. Then added to that as well, many of the Jews who are coming from all different places tend to be Orthodox Jews. And Orthodox Jews tend to have above average birth rates when compared to their more secular counterparts. So just to give you an idea in regard to this, in 1990, the figure of Haredi Jews, so this is Orthodox Jews within Israel, they were at 5%. By 2010, it had risen to 8%. By 2020, it had risen to 12%. And it's estimated that by 2065, 32% of Israel's population will be Haredi Jews, which means that the politics of Israel will shift further and further towards the religious right within Israel. So in conclusion to this video, I have to say that there were several people within the comment sections for some of my earlier videos on this, and they basically said, why did I name this episode as being uncertainty? Because in the present day, Israel's existence is not up for question. Egypt is no threat to it, Jordan's no threat to it, Syria and Lebanon are no threat to it, and neither are the Palestinians. However, what is up for question is with regard to the peace process, because it seems more and more as Israel becomes stronger, as Israel becomes richer, as Israel ends up having more and more of world Jewry centered within Israel. So to give an idea of this, in 1950, just 6% of world Jewry were focused in Israel. By 2020, this figure had risen to 44%. So now Israel was becoming more and more the center of world Jewry. But still, even though its future was secure, it seems that the future for Palestinians is becoming less and less secure because of all these years of their intransigence, because of all these years of, Israel offering peace negotiations even when they didn't need to, of them offering land swaps even when they didn't need to, of them offering more and more territory even when they didn't need to. The fact that the Palestinians each time took this all or nothing approach, this is the reason, I believe, why many people in Israel today are sick of it. And actually, if you speak to people in Israel, if you go to Israel and speak to them, that's the kind of the vibe that you get, that, well, we've tried all this. We tried this in Gaza. We tried this like at the, Camp David. We tried this at Tabor. And yet, time and time again, these guys just keep walking away from it. So forget about it. So I think that the future of this conflict, I think, is going to head more and more towards what you saw within America between the European settlers and the American Indians. And what I mean by that is, where the American Indians now? On reservations. So they're not wiped out, but they're on reservations. And I believe that the Palestinians being pushed more and more into these tiny little sections, aka Area A and B, this is basically what it's going to look like. This is, if there is ever going to be a Palestinian state, this is what it would look like. And it's a thing where it's just not a functioning state. And much in the same way as the Indian reservations today, they are not independent states. I think the same thing is going to happen with Palestine, because that just seems where it's logically heading. So the chance of Palestine having its own state, I think, died with the early 2000s. So I think with that, we have to conclude our video, and I'm sorry you can't end on a happier note. And I think that this video is going to be more controversial than some of the others. But still, if you liked it, nonetheless, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified. And also as well, first of all, next week, I'm going to do a compilation of all of these videos from this series into one big video, because some people might just want to watch it in one big thing rather than watching it in little parts. And then also, I decided that I'm going to do a video on what if Palestine was independent, or something along those lines. So definitely stay tuned for that, which will be out in 2 weeks' time. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.